Good evening, everyone. Tonight I'm going to be doing something a little bit different, and I will be reading a bedtime story from this book called A Beatrix Potter Treasury. And all of the art are from the original Beatrix Potter collection, which she illustrated herself. Before we begin, take a nice, long, deep breath in and out. Find yourself a nice, comfortable chair or lie down in your bed and release all of the tension from your shoulders and your neck and the muscles in your jaw. Once you are fully relaxed, we can begin with the bedtime story. Here's a beautiful watercolor illustration, original Beatrix Potter illustration. It looks like it may have come out of the Flopsy bunny tale, or perhaps the Peter Rabbit tale. And the caption is, "She looked suspiciously at the sack and wondered where everybody was." Maybe we'll find out later where this comes from. And here we have a very animated illustration of Peter Rabbit himself being chased by a very angry Mr. McGregor. I used to read these stories to my little sister when she had trouble going to sleep. And she's still, to this day, very fond of these stories. So this video is for my sister, but it's also for you. And I hope you enjoy it. Contents. The story of Beatrix Potter. The tale of Peter Rabbit. The tale of Benjamin Bunny. The tale of the Flopsy bunnies. The tale of Mr. Todd. A story of a fierce bad rabbit. The tale of Tom Kitten. The tale of Jemima Puddle Duck. The tale of Samuel Whiskers. That's a nice word, whiskers. The tale of the pie and the patty pan. And finally, the tale of Ginger and Pickles. I think tonight I will read for you the tale of Peter Rabbit. And perhaps in other videos, I will read these other stories. It's a lovely sparrow. The beginning of this book has wonderful photographs and illustrations and artwork from the story of Beatrix Potter and her life. I'm extremely fond of her as a historical figure, as a writer, an artist, and a social activist. Perhaps in a later video, we can read this and learn a little bit more about Beatrix Potter and why she was so great. Here are excerpts from her sketchbooks and diary. And here we have the tale of Peter Rabbit. And there he is. About this book. The story of naughty Peter Rabbit in Mr. McGregor's garden first appeared in a picture letter Beatrix Potter wrote to Noel Moore, the young son of her former governess, in 1893. Encouraged by her success in having some greeting card designs published, Beatrix remembered the letter 7 years later and expanded it into a little picture book with black and white illustrations. It was rejected by several publishers, so Beatrix had it printed herself to give it to family and friends. About this time, Frederick Warne agreed to publish the tale if the author would supply color pictures, and the book finally appeared in 1902, priced at 1 shilling, just 5 pence. It was an instant success and has remained so ever since. It has a pacey story with an engaging hero, an exciting chase, and a happy ending, matched with exquisite illustrations, and the result is a children's classic whose appeal is ageless. And that's why I love this story, even though I am a grown-up. Let's begin. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank under the root of a big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there and was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor." Oh dear. Accident indeed. "Now run along and don't get into mischief. I am going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood into the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away into Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. He looks like he's having a great time there. And then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of the cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden and had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages. Teeny tiny little rabbit shoe. And the other shoe amongst the potatoes. The other tiny shoe. After losing them, he ran on all 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he may have gotten away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into the gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not so much water in it. Watering can. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed. Kerchoo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of the window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter, so he went back to work. Peter sat down to rest, and was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity, lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had a large pea in her mouth, and she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it was best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes. But presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon the wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go, along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looking behind him until he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made him some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoonful to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end. I hope by now you are a little bit